Eisenhower made a choice that looked responsible. He chose Montgomery's plan, the safe plan. And in war, safe can be the most expensive word in the room. Because what you save in risk, you pay for in time. And time becomes casualties. People remember the arrows on the map. They remember the speeches. They remember the flags. They don't remember the invisible war underneath the war. The war of control. The war of coordination. The war of not letting victory fall apart because you moved faster than your own system could handle. That's what this is about. Not whether Montgomery was brilliant, not whether Patton was reckless, not whether Eisenhower was cautious. This is about a commander choosing a machine over a man, choosing predictability over momentum, choosing a plan that could be managed, even if it couldn't be finished fast. If you like history told like cause and effect, subscribe. No myths, no hero worship, just the mechanism that makes decisions lethal. Here's the first uncomfortable truth. By late 1944, the Allies weren't asking, "Can we win?" They were asking, "How do we win without breaking ourselves?" That question sounds soft. It isn't. It's brutal. Because when you're winning, you have more power and more things that can fail. Your front gets longer. Your supply stretches thinner, your coalition gets louder. Your commanders start competing for credit, resources, and tempo. Victory creates friction, and friction kills speed. On paper, the situation looked simple. Germany was pushed back, the Allies had momentum, the enemy was bleeding. But the map was lying. Maps show distance, they don't show capacity. They don't show what a road can carry at midnight. They don't show how many trucks are broken down behind the front. They don't show fuel. They don't show who is angry at whom in a coalition meeting. They don't show how many decisions a staff can process before it starts making mistakes. They don't show the real limit. Momentum feels like a force of nature, like a wave, and commanders fall in love with it. But momentum isn't magic. It's logistics that haven't collapsed yet. Every mile forward is a promise you have to keep. Food, fuel, ammo, spare parts, engineers, bridges, medical evacuation. It's all a chain, and chains don't care about courage. They care about throughput. So when people say, "Why didn't they just press harder?" they imagine war like a sprint. Late war operations are not a sprint. They're a high-speed convoy on a road system built for a different century. One accident can stop the whole column. And when the whole column stops, the enemy breathes. That's the trade. Now, here's the second uncomfortable truth. The Allied problem wasn't simply beating Germany. It was controlling the victory. Because the Allied army wasn't one army. It was multiple national forces stitched together into a single front. Different commanders, different politics, different priorities, different egos. That stitching mattered. Eisenhower wasn't just choosing tactics. He was choosing what kind of war the coalition could actually execute without tearing itself in half. When you manage a coalition, you learn something fast. A bold plan can win quickly, or it can explode into a crisis you can't repair. And the worst part is this. Even when a bold plan fails only a little, the damage spreads everywhere. Supply plans break. Timelines crack. Allies blame each other. Commanders start freelancing. Then your war becomes 5 wars, and the enemy survives inside your confusion. So Eisenhower needed something more than a brilliant attack. He needed a plan that would not produce a political emergency if it hit friction. That's why safe looked attractive. Safe meant controlled pacing. Safe meant tighter coordination. Safe meant fewer surprises. Safe meant fewer opportunities for someone to do something dramatic and impossible to support. Montgomery's approach wasn't built for spectacle. It was built for control. Set-piece pressure, deliberate preparation, measured advances, clear phases, clear boundaries, clear responsibility. That kind of war is easier to manage at the top because it behaves. But control has a trade-off. Control slows momentum. And in late war operations, momentum is a currency. It collapses an enemy before they can reorganize. It turns retreat into panic. It makes commanders make bad decisions because they're reacting, not planning. Momentum is what turns a strong position into a weak one, before the enemy can pour concrete and lay wire. So the choice wasn't simply safe versus risky. It was control versus speed. And speed is never free. Speed spends fuel. Speed spends tires. Speed spends trucks. Speed spends roads. Speed spends staff capacity. Speed spends attention. Most of all, speed spends your ability to see what's happening behind the lead elements. When you move fast, your picture of the battlefield becomes delayed. Reports arrive late. Maps are outdated. Decisions are made on stale information. And suddenly, the thing you called momentum becomes a forward stumble into a trap you didn't know existed. Eisenhower understood that. He had seen enough to know that the catastrophe in war is rarely the obvious one. The obvious catastrophe is defeat. The real catastrophe is a partial failure that creates a chain reaction. That's why he didn't just want to win. He wanted a system that could absorb shocks. Now look at Montgomery through that lens. Montgomery offered something Eisenhower could sell to a coalition: a method, a structure, a tempo. He offered predictability. And predictability isn't glamorous, but to a supreme commander, it's oxygen. Because predictability allows you to allocate resources rationally. It allows you to plan supply flows. It allows you to coordinate multiple armies without constant improvisation. It allows you to tell politicians and allies what is happening and what will happen. It allows you to keep the machine from shaking itself apart. But here's the part that hurts. Predictability also tells the enemy what tomorrow looks like. The enemy doesn't need to win everywhere. They need time. Time to move reserves, time to build defenses, time to choose where they'll make you pay. A cautious plan gives the enemy that time. So safe doesn't remove danger. It shifts danger into the future when it's harder to solve. When the enemy is more organized, when the battlefield is more fortified, when every assault costs more men for fewer miles. That's the hidden exchange rate. Risk now versus casualties later. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Because war punishes hesitation in a very specific way. It makes the last battles the worst battles. Early in a collapse, the enemy runs. Late in a collapse, the enemy digs in. And digging in is when you start spending lives in bulk. This is why aggressive commanders inside the Allied HQ were furious. To them, the enemy was already cracking. The German army was in retreat. The air was dominated. The strategic situation was deteriorating for Germany. They believed the solution was simple: press non-stop, deny the enemy breath, deny them the ability to stabilize. And when Eisenhower sided with Montgomery's method, it didn't feel like strategy to them. It felt like restraint at the exact moment restraint was unnecessary. It looked like someone choosing paperwork over pressure. But Eisenhower wasn't making a romantic decision. He was making an administrative one. He had to protect supply, protect flanks, protect unity, protect the schedule of multiple armies competing for the same fuel and roads. He had to protect the coalition from itself. Because that's the nightmare scenario no one likes to say out loud. You can be winning the war and still lose control of the war. That's what playing safe really means at the top. It's not fear, it's containment. Containment of chaos. Containment of ego. Containment of logistical failure. Containment of political fallout. A commander like Eisenhower lives in a different world than a commander at the tip of a spear. At the tip, you see opportunity. At the top, you see fragility. And fragility is real. One plan that outpaces supply doesn't just stall, it creates a vacuum. And vacuums in war get filled by enemy counterattacks, by confusion, by blame, by commanders pulling in different directions. That's why Eisenhower leaned toward control, because when you're managing a machine this big, the most dangerous thing isn't a German division, it's an Allied plan that becomes impossible to support. And there was one kind of commander who could turn impossible to support into a lifestyle. Not because he was stupid, not because he lacked courage, but because he moved like momentum itself. A man like that can win you miles. He can also steal your ability to manage the war. That's the real tension underneath the safe plan. Eisenhower didn't just choose Montgomery's approach because it minimized disaster. He chose it because it kept the battlefield legible. It kept the coalition coherent. It kept the war governable. And that governability had a price, not measured in pride, measured in time. And in war, time is the one resource you can't replace. If you want to understand Eisenhower's decision, stop thinking about plans. Start thinking about permission. In modern war, the real permission slip is fuel. Fuel decides who moves. Fuel decides who pauses. Fuel decides who gets to be bold and who gets to be responsible. And here's the quiet truth. Once you're rationing fuel, you're no longer arguing about tactics. You're choosing winners inside your own coalition. Not with medals, with gasoline. People talk about momentum like it's courage. But momentum is a pipeline that hasn't snapped yet. When the Allies broke out and started moving fast, something inevitable happened. The advance got ahead of the system. The front surged forward, and the infrastructure behind it didn't magically transform. Roads didn't widen because you wanted them to. Rail lines didn't repair themselves out of optimism. Ports didn't unload faster because you were winning. So the war became a race between two clocks. Clock 1, the enemy trying to stabilize. Clock 2, your logistics trying to catch up. And the second clock is the one commanders love to ignore until it starts vetoing their plans. Because logistics doesn't argue. It just says no. No fuel, no ammo, no spare parts, no bridging equipment, no trucks, no time. And when logistics says no, it doesn't matter how brilliant your plan looked on a map. Your plan becomes a speech. This is where Eisenhower's world turns brutal. He didn't have a single army asking for supplies. He had multiple national forces, multiple commanders, each with their own sense of urgency, each convinced they were one push away from ending the war. And each push required the same scarce things. So scarcity became politics. Every gallon given to one army was a gallon denied to another. Every truck route prioritized for one commander delayed another commander's offensive. Every main effort was an insult to someone else's ego. In that environment, strategy becomes resource allocation, and resource allocation becomes control. This is why Montgomery's plan wasn't just attractive tactically, it was attractive administratively. Because Montgomery's method aligned with how a coalition must be managed. Clear priorities, clear phases, clear lines of responsibility, clear demands on supply. It fit the machine. But the machine had a problem. The machine was fighting with a man who moved like a wildfire. Patton didn't see fuel as a constraint. He saw it as a dare. He was built for exploitation, for speed, for turning retreat into collapse. And the faster he moved, the more he demanded. Fuel, ammo, trucks, priority, attention. That's not a moral judgment, that's physics. Speed requires flow. Flow requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires time. So when Patton surged, he forced Eisenhower into a choice that looks small on paper and enormous in reality. Do you feed the fastest spear, or do you feed the system? Because feeding the spear means you accept what comes with it. Unpredictable distances, unpredictable objectives, unpredictable risks. You can't allocate just enough to a commander like that and expect him to move politely. If you give him fuel, he will turn it into miles. And miles turn into new problems you didn't plan for. New flanks, new gaps, new supply demands, new political questions. And when those questions arrive, they arrive as emergencies. That is the part people miss. The problem wasn't simply that Patton was aggressive. The problem was that Patton creates situations that demand immediate decisions from the top. And top-level decisions in a coalition are slow by nature. A coalition is a committee with guns. Committees do not love surprises. So Patton's speed wasn't just a battlefield phenomenon. It was a command and control problem. He made the war harder to govern, and Eisenhower's job, above all, was governance. Here's a micro reveal that changes how the whole argument looks. Eisenhower didn't need a plan that could win. He needed a plan that could be supplied without turning the coalition into a civil war. That's why logistics is not a background detail. It's the center of the story. Because once you admit logistics is the limiter, you see what SAFE really buys. SAFE buys predictability of demand. SAFE buys a stable schedule. SAFE buys the ability to tell an ally, here is your role, and have that role remain true tomorrow. SAFE buys control. Now, this is where the story tightens. Montgomery's idea, at its core, is a bet on concentration. Concentrate force, concentrate supply, concentrate the main effort. Because if supply is scarce, you can't feed everyone's offensive equally. So you pick one. You make it the priority. You drive that thrust hard. On paper, it's clean. It creates a single decisive push. But it also does something else. It forces the coalition to accept hierarchy, and hierarchy is exactly what coalition commanders resist, unless the supreme commander enforces it. So Eisenhower faced a paradox. To go fast, he needed to choose a single direction and feed it. To keep the coalition stable, he needed to distribute enough to keep everyone cooperative. To avoid disaster, he needed control. You can't satisfy all three perfectly. You pick what you can live with. Eisenhower chose what he could live with. He chose governability. And governability has a weapon. That weapon is the supply faucet. You want speed? You need fuel. You want fuel? You need the supreme commander to sign off. And that signature is not just operational, it's political. Because once you make one commander the main effort, you're also making a statement to every other commander. You are secondary. Secondary means fewer resources, less prestige, less leverage, and leverage is everything in a coalition. This is where Patton becomes more than a general. He becomes a variable. Not a variable in combat ability, a variable in control. A government can be negotiated with. A general with a clear chain of command can be managed. A plan with phases can be monitored. But a commander who turns fuel into sudden distance turns the war into a moving target. And moving targets are harder to coordinate, harder to supply, harder to defend, harder to explain to allies, harder to justify when it goes wrong. That's why the problem wasn't what Patton could do to Germany. It was what he might do next. Because next creates commitments. If Patton breaks through, you must support him or abandon him. If you support him, you divert supply from others. If you divert supply, you create resentment and gaps. If you create gaps, the enemy counterattacks. If the enemy counterattacks, the whole front pays. That chain happens fast, and it doesn't care what your original plan was. This is why speed is addictive and dangerous. It makes you feel like you're solving the war, while it quietly creates debts behind you. Debts in fuel, debts in ammunition, debts in maintenance, debts in security, debts in coordination. Those debts come due at the worst moment. Eisenhower understood that. He wasn't looking at a map and thinking, who is the best tactician? He was looking at a machine and thinking, what can this machine sustain without breaking? That's why playing safe is not cowardice. It's budgeting, and budgeting is ruthless. It means telling ambitious commanders no. It means denying opportunities that look decisive. It means choosing a slower, more controllable tempo because you can't afford a crisis. But here's the knife edge. Every time you choose control over speed, you hand the enemy time. And time is the enemy's most reliable ally. Time lets them regroup. Time lets them fortify. Time lets them move reserves to the place you finally decided to hit. So the Supreme Commander lives inside a constant trade. If I go fast, I risk chaos. If I go controlled, I risk paying in blood later. That's the trap. And inside that trap, Patton was not just a tool. He was a temptation. Because he represented the dream of ending it quickly. He represented the idea that you could outrun the enemy's ability to recover, that you could turn a retreat into a collapse, that you could win faster than politics could argue. That dream is exactly what a coalition commander must be careful with. Because if the dream fails, you don't just lose time, you lose credibility. And credibility is what holds alliances together. If you want war explained like mechanics, subscribe. Because this is where history stops being a story about personalities and becomes a story about systems. Eisenhower was managing a system of nations. Montgomery offered a system of war. Patton offered momentum. Momentum is powerful. Momentum is also uncontrollable once it's loose. And the more uncontrollable a force is, the more it scares people who think in terms of stability. The terrifying thing about a variable is not that it's weak. It's that it doesn't reliably obey your priorities. A variable forces reaction. Reaction creates mistakes. Mistakes create openings. That's why Eisenhower leaned toward the kind of plan that reduced variables. Less improvisation, less freelancing, less sudden demands that rip supply schedules apart. More control, more predictability, more governance. Because once you accept that supply is the gatekeeper, you see the deepest truth of the late war. The Allies were not just fighting Germany, they were fighting the limits of their own velocity. And the limit wasn't German courage, it was Allied capacity. Capacity to move men and fuel. Capacity to coordinate decisions. Capacity to keep the coalition aligned while the front kept changing shape. Eisenhower chose Montgomery's plan because it treated that capacity as sacred, because it assumed friction was inevitable, because it built the offensive around what could be supported, not what could be imagined. But the moment you do that, you create a new kind of battlefield. A battlefield where your biggest enemy is no longer surprise. It's time. And time has consequences beyond the front line. Because every day the war continues, the world outside the battlefield keeps moving. Borders harden. Influence expands. Promises get rewritten by facts on the ground. And somewhere to the east, someone is watching the calendar. Not with fear, with calculation. War isn't only decided by who advances, it's decided by who arrives first. Not to a river, to a capital, to a border. To a negotiation. Because the moment an army stands on ground, that ground starts to belong to their future. This is where the safe plan stops being just operational. This is where it becomes geopolitical. Eisenhower's war was fought on roads and bridges. Stalin's war was fought on calendars. The Western Allies could afford to talk about efficiency. They could argue about tempo. They could debate the correct way to apply pressure. Stalin didn't debate. He absorbed. He understood the simplest law of the endgame. Every week the war continues, the map of the post-war world becomes more predetermined. And that law has a brutal implication. If you slow in the West, the East doesn't just keep moving. The East starts deciding what victory will mean. People think Stalin feared weapons. He didn't. Weapons can be counted. Weapons can be rationed. Weapons can be negotiated around. Stalin feared something else. He feared uncontrollable people. Because governments can be managed. Parties can be infiltrated. Committees can be pressured. States can be threatened, bribed, isolated. But an uncontrollable man with an army behind him? That's a different category. That's not a bargaining partner. That's a weather event. This is why the Patton variable matters far beyond his sector. Not because Patton could beat the Germans faster. Plenty of commanders wanted that. Because Patton represented momentum that didn't wait for permission. Momentum that didn't always match the political script. Momentum that could force outcomes before diplomats could shape them. And Stalin hated outcomes he didn't author. Control was Stalin's religion. Control of narrative, control of institutions, control of borders, control of who could speak, move, organize. He didn't build a system to win debates. He built a system to remove randomness from power. So when Stalin looked west, he didn't see allies, he saw a coalition. Coalitions are slow. Coalitions argue. Coalitions negotiate internally before they move externally. Coalitions create paperwork, and paperwork is time. Time was the one weapon Stalin didn't have to manufacture. He only had to receive it. Every day of Allied deliberation was a day the Red Army could turn military progress into political inevitability. Here's the micro-reveal that most narratives skip. The late war wasn't just a race to Berlin. It was a race to define the terms of the peace by occupying the future. Occupation isn't a footnote, it's policy with boots. When an army liberates a city, it doesn't just remove an enemy, it installs an order. It decides who holds weapons on the street the next morning. It decides who runs the radio station. It decides who gets arrested as a collaborator. It decides which parties are acceptable. It decides what newspapers can print. It decides what flags appear in public squares. So when people ask why time mattered, this is the answer. Time wasn't only casualties. Time was governments. And this is where Eisenhower's safe choice begins to glow with irony. Because the same control Eisenhower needed to manage his coalition was also the control that slowed the coalition down. And every hour of control was an hour of permission granted to the East. Now, keep the cause and effect chain tight. Eisenhower chooses a plan that reduces operational chaos. That choice slows the tempo. Slower tempo gives the enemy more time to stabilize. But it also gives Stalin more time to arrive. And arriving first isn't just a military advantage, it's leverage. Leverage means you don't have to persuade. You don't have to compromise. You consult. You sit at a table and discuss what to do with territories you already occupy. That's a different kind of negotiation. So what would Stalin prefer the Western Allies to do? He would prefer them to be predictable. He would prefer them to move in set pieces. He would prefer them to require consensus for every shift in emphasis. He would prefer them to be governed. Because governed forces can be anticipated, and anticipated forces can be outmaneuvered politically. This is why unpredictability was a threat. Because unpredictability breaks prediction, and prediction is the foundation of Stalin's control. If one Western commander suddenly breaks through, suddenly arrives somewhere earlier than expected, suddenly forces a new fact on the ground, Stalin doesn't get to choose the shape of the post-war map as cleanly. He has to react. And Stalin hated reacting. Reaction is where mistakes happen. Mistakes are where control slips. Control slipping is where systems start collapsing. Stalin didn't run a state. He ran an instrument panel. And the instrument panel requires stable inputs. A wild variable like Patton is unstable input. That doesn't mean Patton would have started a new war. That's not the claim. The claim is simpler and more dangerous. A commander who moves faster than politics can follow forces politics to follow anyway. That is terrifying to anyone whose power depends on being ahead of events, not behind them. Now pull it back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower wasn't planning against Stalin. Not openly, not officially. But he was operating inside a reality where Stalin was part of the outcome whether you liked it or not. And that reality created a second front inside Eisenhower's mind. The first front was Germany. The second front was the shape of Europe after Germany. And this is where the safe plan becomes a moral paradox. Because the safe plan reduces the chance of an Allied disaster, but it increases the chance that the end of the war produces a different kind of disaster, one that doesn't explode on a battlefield. It freezes into borders. It becomes the kind of disaster you can't solve with tanks later, because solving it later means something worse. So the coalition commander is forced into choosing which kind of tragedy is acceptable. Immediate chaos that could cost the war effort, or long-term consequences that will define the peace. You can see why Eisenhower leaned into governability. If your coalition breaks, you don't get to argue about borders. You don't get to negotiate anything. You get to survive the diplomatic wreckage of your own failure. So he chose the plan that protected the machine. But protecting the machine meant accepting the clock, and the clock belonged to Stalin. This is why the safe label is deceptive. It's safe in one dimension and costly in another. Safe tactically can be expensive strategically. Safe operationally can be expensive politically. And that's the core theme: control versus unpredictability. Stalin is pure control, a system designed to eliminate randomness. Patton is personal momentum, a human engine that creates outcomes faster than committees can approve. Eisenhower is the manager caught between them, choosing how much unpredictability he can tolerate without losing control of his own war. If you like this kind of analysis, where history is treated like a system with constraints, subscribe. Because the next layer is the one that makes the whole decision feel colder. It isn't about courage, it isn't about ego. It's about what happens when a cautious plan gives the enemy time and gives your own side excuses. Because once you slow down, everyone finds reasons to slow down more. That's how momentum dies. And when momentum dies, wars don't end, they grind. Grinding is where the casualty numbers climb quietly. Grinding is where victory becomes a cost account. Grinding is where safe starts collecting interest. The tragedy is that nobody at the top chooses grinding on purpose. They choose control. They choose stability. They choose a plan that can be managed. And then the managed plan stretches the war. And the stretched war writes the post-war world. Stalin could negotiate with governments. He could pressure parties. He could bargain with committees. But a variable you can't negotiate with. That's the one thing a control system cannot tolerate. That's why unpredictability matters. Not because it's noble, because it forces reality to move before power can shape it. And power hates being late. A cautious plan feels humane. Less risk, fewer surprises, fewer headline disasters. But war doesn't grade you on intentions. War grades you on calendars. Because time doesn't vanish, it converts. It converts into enemy recovery. It converts into fortifications. It converts into reorganized reserves. It converts into new defensive lines that weren't there when the enemy was still running. And once those lines exist, you don't push through, you pay through. That's the cost nobody wants to say out loud when they argue for the safe plan. Safe isn't free. Safe is a payment plan. It delays catastrophe today and charges you interest tomorrow. Here's what that interest looks like. When you slow down, the enemy starts making better decisions. Not heroic decisions, practical ones. They stop improvising. They stop retreating in panic. They start choosing where they want you to fight. And that is the moment the war changes. Early collapse is about pursuit. Late resistance is about preparation. Prepared resistance is where casualties spike. Because prepared resistance forces you to do the one thing attackers hate: attack into structure. Wire, mines, pre-registered artillery, kill zones, camouflage, fallback positions, counterattack plans that are written, not imagined. This is why momentum matters so much. Momentum doesn't just take ground, it prevents the enemy from turning ground into a weapon. Every day you give the enemy is a day they can turn terrain into math. Angles, fields of fire, supply dumps placed behind cover, routes for reserves, bridges rigged. Road junctions trapped. That's the hidden brutality of playing safe. It gives the enemy the one gift they can reliably use: time. Now bring it back to Eisenhower's dilemma. He's staring at a coalition machine that needs control. He's staring at a battlefield that rewards speed. And he's staring at an enemy that is not dead, just pressured. So he chooses control. That choice stabilizes the machine, but it also changes the psychology of the entire war effort. Because tempo isn't only movement, tempo is belief. When an army believes the end is close, it behaves differently. It takes risks. It improvises. It pushes harder. It tolerates uncertainty because the reward feels immediate. When an army believes the end is scheduled, it behaves differently. It becomes procedural. It starts asking for perfect conditions. It starts demanding guarantees. It starts waiting for full supply instead of exploiting weakness. Not because soldiers are lazy, because institutions learn. And institutions learn the wrong lesson fast. If we wait, we're safe. That's the trap. The SAFE plan doesn't just reduce risk, it trains everyone to prefer low-risk decisions. And low-risk decisions accumulate into high-cost wars. Because a war isn't lost in a single bad day, it's extended by 1,000 cautious days. Micro reveal. Wars don't usually become long because nobody can win. They become long because the winner chooses a style of victory that takes time. And time is what multiplies casualties. Not in one dramatic explosion, in a steady, relentless grind. The kind of grind that doesn't look like failure. It looks like progress. A few miles, a town, a bridge, a ridgeline. Small gains that add up, but only after you spend men like currency. This is why aggressive commanders were furious. They weren't angry because they wanted glory. They were angry because they could smell the shift. They could feel the moment when the enemy stops collapsing and starts organizing. They could feel the window closing. And once the window closes, you don't reopen it with optimism. You reopen it with artillery and funerals. Now, zoom in on the human mechanism of this. When you slow down, your attacks become predictable. Predictability is comfort for a defender. A defender doesn't need to win everywhere. They need to make you bleed enough that you choose to slow down even more. It's a feedback loop. Caution reduces speed. Reduced speed increases resistance. Increased resistance increases casualties. Casualties increase caution. SAFE becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the enemy, watching this loop, does something smart. They stop trying to stop you everywhere. They start trying to stop you at the places that matter most. Places that funnel your movement. Choke points, river crossings, road junctions, dense terrain where armor can't maneuver, bad weather windows. And once they choose the terms, your advantage shrinks. You still have more men, more fuel, more shells, more planes. But advantage isn't the same as efficiency. You can have a massive advantage and still pay a massive price if the defender forces you into slow, expensive methods. That's how a losing side extracts blood from a winning side, by turning the war into a series of costs you can't avoid. And if you think SAFE prevents that, here's the cold answer. SAFE makes that more likely. Because SAFE gives the defender the only thing that allows them to design those costs: time. Now the story has another sharp edge. A cautious operational tempo doesn't just affect Germany, it affects your own coalition. As the war drags, pressure builds behind the front. Politicians want results. Publics get tired. Allies argue about sacrifices and credit. And commanders start playing a different game. Not, how do we end this fast? But, how do we end this in a way that proves my contribution? That game is poisonous, because it fractures unity. It turns resource allocation into rivalry. It turns strategy meetings into bargaining sessions. And every bargaining session is another day of war. Eisenhower knew this too. That's why control felt like safety. Control is what keeps rivalry from becoming sabotage. Control is what keeps everyone moving in the same direction, even when they disagree. But control also slows adaptation. It slows exploitation. It punishes initiative, because initiative creates unpredictability. The machine protects itself. And while the machine protects itself, the enemy survives longer than they should. This is the part that feels almost unfair. Eisenhower was right to fear chaos, because chaos can lose wars. But the absence of chaos can extend wars, and extension is its own kind of loss. A loss you can still call victory, but only after you count the dead. Here's another micro reveal. A SAFE plan doesn't reduce suffering. It changes the shape of suffering. Instead of one sharp gamble, you get months of grinding certainty. Instead of a single risky leap, you get 1,000 costly steps, and every step has a casualty list attached to it. That's why playing safe can be expensive, because a war of attrition is not neutral. It's a machine that eats people at a predictable rate. predictable, manageable, and horrifying. Now, at this point, some people try to escape the argument by saying, better slow and sure than fast and reckless. It sounds wise, but wisdom in war is not a slogan. Wisdom is knowing where the real risk lives. Sometimes the bigger risk is not moving too fast. It's moving too slow when the enemy is weakest. Because weakness is temporary. Every day you don't exploit it, you help the enemy manufacture strength. And the moment the enemy manufactures strength, you stop dictating. You start negotiating with the battlefield. You trade speed for certainty. Then you trade certainty for blood. And the trade keeps getting worse. This is why the safe plan becomes emotionally controversial. It doesn't look like a mistake in a single moment. It looks like professionalism. It looks like adults in charge. It looks like caution. And then it quietly becomes a conveyor belt of casualties. Not because the plan is stupid, because the plan is slow. And slow gives the enemy permission to turn the war into a bill you have to pay. If you like this kind of analysis, subscribe, because this is the point where the story stops being about commanders and starts being about inevitabilities. When you choose control, you often choose a longer war. When you choose a longer war, you choose a higher body count. Not by cruelty, by arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how responsible the decision felt. The real question isn't, was Montgomery's plan safe? The real question is, safe for whom? Safe for coalition management, safe for political stability, safe against catastrophic embarrassment, but not safe for the men who have to fight the extra weeks and months that safety creates. And that brings us to the last missing piece. Because there's a moment in every war when the losing side realizes they can't win. So they stop trying to win. They start trying to control the end. They start trying to choose how the war finishes, where it finishes, and what it costs you. When you slow down, you give them that moment. And once they have it, they can do something that is tactically irrational and strategically deadly. They can gamble. They can throw everything into one counterstroke. Not because it will win the war, because it will buy time, because it will disrupt your tempo, because it will make you cautious again. And if it works even partially, it extends the grind. That's how a defeated enemy still hurts you. Not by defeating you, by delaying you. Time becomes blood. Blood becomes caution. Caution becomes more time. That loop is the true cost of playing safe. There is a moment in every collapsing war when the losing side stops thinking about victory and starts thinking about disruption. Not how do we win, how do we make them slower? Because slowing the winner is the only way a loser can still shape the ending. That's the enemy's last power, not strength, timing. And if you want to understand why playing safe becomes expensive, you have to understand what time gives the defeated. Time gives them options they don't deserve. A collapsing army is dangerous in a specific way, not because it's strong, because it's desperate. Desperation makes you do things you wouldn't do if you expected to survive the long game. It makes you gamble. Gambles are irrational if you're trying to win slowly, but they are logical if you're trying to reset the clock. Germany's situation late in the war forced that logic. They didn't have the resources to outproduce the Allies. They couldn't win the air war. They couldn't trade casualties forever. So the only remaining path was to create shock. Shock can do something brute force can't. Shock can create hesitation. Shock can force the winning side to stop moving forward and start looking inward. Checking flanks, reconfirming plans, recounting supplies, asking for certainty. And that shift, forward to inward, is what buys time. Here's the micro reveal. A big enemy counterattack doesn't need to succeed strategically to succeed psychologically. It only needs to make you cautious again, because caution is contagious. One surprise doesn't just change one front, it changes the entire command culture. Suddenly, every commander starts seeing ghosts. Suddenly, every staff starts padding estimates. Suddenly, every request for fuel comes with a thicker justification. Suddenly, every advance gets delayed until we're sure. That's how a losing side turns one bold move into months of friction. Now, why is this tied to Eisenhower choosing control? Because systems that prioritize control are strong in one way and vulnerable in another. They are strong against chaos they can predict. They are vulnerable to chaos that hits the seams. Coalitions have seams, boundaries between armies, differences in doctrine, differences in communication, gaps that appear not because people are incompetent, but because the system is too large to be perfectly tight. And the more you stretch the front, the more seams you create. The Allies were pushing, they were extending, they were consuming roads and fuel at an enormous rate. Even with a controlled plan, the front was still massive, still complicated, still full of weak spots. The safe plan doesn't remove seams, it just tries to manage them. And if the enemy can find one seam at the right moment, they don't need to fight the whole machine. They only need to jam one gear. That's the essence of a late war gamble. Hit where the system is least ready. Hit when the weather helps. Hit when complacency is highest. Hit when the winner is already thinking about the end. Because that's when attention drops. That's another uncomfortable truth. Success makes you careless in predictable ways. When you believe the enemy is finished, you stop treating every shadow like a threat. You stop expecting ambition from a defeated army. You start assuming rational behavior. But rational behavior is a luxury. A dying force doesn't behave rationally. It behaves violently. So when the counterattack comes, it feels impossible. Not because it's brilliant, because you had decided it wouldn't happen. And that decision is what makes it powerful. Now watch what happens to the entire Allied calculus the moment the shock hits. The system reacts like a body. First response, stabilize. Second response, contain. Third response, reorganize. Fourth response, resume. Those steps sound orderly. They are also slow. They cost time, and time costs lives. Not only because men die in the counterattack itself, but because the counterattack forces the entire coalition to pause, shift, and rebuild momentum. Momentum is fragile. It takes weeks to build and hours to lose. This is why a late war enemy gamble is so lethal to the winner's timetable. It isn't just a battle, it is a momentum tax. And every momentum tax has consequences beyond the battlefield. Because while the Western Allies are stabilizing and re-coordinating, the Eastern clock keeps ticking. Stalin doesn't need the enemy gamble to succeed. He only needs it to delay. Delay is enough. Delay means the Red Army advances farther before the end. Delay means more cities liberated into the Soviet system. Delay means more post-war leverage locked in by occupation. So one German gamble can echo into borders, not because it changes the final outcome of the war, because it changes the shape of the peace. Now, zoom in on Eisenhower in this moment. This is where his caution looks justified, because a sudden crisis is exactly what a supreme commander fears. A crisis forces messy decisions. It forces rapid reallocations. It forces arguments about priority. It forces national leaders to demand answers. And it forces him to do the one thing he never wants to do: admit uncertainty. That's why control is so attractive. Control is the promise that you won't be surprised into embarrassment. So when the enemy gamble happens, everyone points to it and says, "See? This is why we needed caution." And they're not wrong. But here's the twist that makes the story sharper. The counterattack doesn't only justify caution, it weaponizes caution. Because once a coalition experiences shock, it becomes easier for every cautious impulse to win future arguments. Remember what happened last time. Remember the surprise. Remember the risk. That memory becomes a brake the enemy can use even after the enemy is weaker. So the loser's gamble creates a new strategic environment. Not stronger German forces, stronger Allied hesitation. That's the real success condition. Now, here's where Patton returns as the variable. A crisis reveals what a system is missing. Systems are good at procedures. They are not naturally good at sudden pivots. Coalitions can surge, but surges require a kind of leadership that tolerates speed and uncertainty. And that is exactly what the system tries to suppress most of the time. So when the crisis hits, the coalition needs the very thing it spent months restraining: momentum. It needs a commander who can move without waiting for a perfect picture. A commander who can turn incomplete information into action. A commander who can shift an entire formation quickly because he doesn't require the world to be tidy first. This is the paradox of control. You spend the war trying to reduce variables. Then the battlefield forces you to use one. And when that variable works, everyone celebrates the result, while still fearing the nature of the variable. Because you can love what momentum does and still hate that you can't predict where it goes. That's why the Patton problem never goes away. He is useful when the system is in pain. He is dangerous when the system is comfortable. And comfort is what makes you slow. So the enemy gamble creates an ironic cycle. The coalition slows to be safe. The enemy gambles to exploit seams. The gamble creates shock. Shock forces the coalition to rely on speed again. Speed creates new unpredictability. Unpredictability scares the coalition. The coalition slows again. A pendulum between control and momentum. And every swing costs time. Every swing costs lives. This is why the debate over playing safe is so hard. Because the safe argument is strongest at the moment of shock, and the speed argument is strongest just before the shock. After shock, people fear risk. Before shock, people fear delay. Both fears are rational. Both can kill. The question is not which fear is correct. The question is which fear produces the higher total cost. That's what Eisenhower had to estimate, not with perfect information, with responsibility. Now, let's make the chain explicit. A cautious plan slows tempo. Slow tempo gives the enemy time to prepare a gamble. The gamble creates shock. Shock validates caution. Validated caution slows tempo further. Further delay increases the blood price. Further delay increases the geopolitical price. And the man who benefits from delay doesn't wear a German uniform. That's the coldest layer of the story. The German gamble is a blade pointed at Allied momentum, but the shadow behind it is a border. So when you hear safe, don't picture safety. Picture a system trying to protect itself from shock. Because shock is the one thing a coalition can't easily metabolize. Shock creates blame. Blame creates fractures. Fractures create paralysis. Eisenhower's priority was to prevent paralysis. But preventing paralysis required rules. Rules required control. Control required predictable tempo. And predictable tempo was exactly what the enemy needed to choose the moment of surprise. That's the price of governability. And once you see it, you see the final problem. Because if a coalition is slow by nature, and the enemy can exploit that slowness with one gamble, then every plan becomes haunted by the same question. Do you move carefully and accept the enemy's chance to reset the clock? Or do you move fast and accept the chance that your own system breaks? This is the point where history stops being about who was right and becomes about what was survivable. If you want more of this, subscribe. Because the final verdict isn't about praising aggressiveness or condemning caution. It's about understanding the difference between a plan that avoids disaster and a plan that ends the war. Because avoiding disaster is a management goal. Ending the war is a strategic goal. And sometimes those goals collide. In that collision, safe wins meetings. But safe doesn't always win calendars. And calendars decide the real outcome, not just who surrenders, but what the world looks like afterward. At the highest level, war stops being about bravery. It becomes about error tolerance. Not can we win, can we keep winning without a failure that breaks everything? That's the mental world Eisenhower lived in. He wasn't leading a single army, he was leading a coalition machine. A machine held together by agreements, by priorities, by trust. And trust is fragile. One operational catastrophe doesn't just cost men, it costs credibility. Credibility with allies, credibility with governments, credibility with publics, credibility with commanders who will start freelancing the moment they think the top is gambling. Eisenhower could not afford that. So when he chose Montgomery's plan, he wasn't voting for caution as a personality trait. He was voting for a war that could be governed. Governed means legible. Governed means paced. Governed means supplied. Governed means coordinated. Governed means the coalition stays one coalition. That was the priority. Because if the coalition fractures, everything else becomes irrelevant. No supply system, no unified front, no shared objectives, no shared post-war settlement. You don't win with a fractured coalition, you limp. And limping is how you turn victory into a political defeat. So Eisenhower optimized for the thing most viewers don't see: the stability of the war effort. He chose the plan that minimized the chance of a catastrophic spiral. A spiral looks like this. One thrust outruns support. That thrust stalls. The enemy counterattacks into the gap. Another Allied army is forced to stop its own offensive to stabilize. Fuel gets rerouted. Timelines collapse. Commanders accuse each other. Politicians demand answers. The coalition starts negotiating with itself instead of fighting the enemy. That's the nightmare. Not a single lost battle. A chain reaction that makes the war unmanageable. Eisenhower's whole career made him allergic to chain reactions, so he chose a method that reduced them. That's why safe is the wrong way to frame it. Safe implies comfort. This wasn't comfort. This was risk management with lives and nations. And risk management always looks like restraint from the outside. Now here's the other side of the verdict. The controlled choice wasn't free. It cost time. It cost initiative. It cost the ability to convert enemy retreat into enemy collapse. It cost the most valuable thing in late war operations: a shortening of the war. And anything that delays the end increases the total blood price. Not in a dramatic way, in an arithmetic way. More days at the front means more contact. More contact means more casualties. More casualties means more caution. More caution means more days. The loop tightens. This is the core tragedy of governable war. A governable war is easier to run, but it can be harder to finish, because finishing often requires exploiting moments that are inherently messy. Moments of enemy weakness, moments of confusion, moments where speed outruns perfect coordination. Those moments are gifts. They don't last. If you don't take them, you don't get them back later. Later, the enemy is organized. Later, the enemy is fortified. Later, you are attacking into structure. So by choosing governability, Eisenhower accepted a risk he didn't publicly label as risk. He accepted delay. And delay is expensive. It doesn't explode like a disaster. It accumulates like debt. One more week, then another. A few more prepared defenses, a few more cleared minefields, a few more river crossings under fire, a few more casualty lists that don't change policy because they arrive as normal. Normal is what prolonged wars feed on. Now fold in the geopolitical layer. Delay isn't only casualties. Delay is also arrival order. Every day the Western Allies spend governing their tempo is a day the Red Army spends occupying the future. Eisenhower's choice kept his coalition stable. It also made the post-war map more stable in another direction, a direction he could not fully control. This is why the SAFE plan is so psychologically seductive and so strategically dangerous. It protects you against the kind of failure you can't explain, but it exposes you to the kind of outcome you can't reverse. A battlefield catastrophe is visible. A political boundary is permanent, and boundaries are made by time. Now bring the theme home. Control versus unpredictability. Montgomery represents control as doctrine, phased war, managed pressure, predictable demands on the system. Patton represents unpredictability as momentum, improvisation, exploitation, speed that forces decisions. Eisenhower represents the choice, not between good and bad, between two costs. Cost 1, risk of operational chaos. Cost 2, certainty of extended war. He chose the cost he could manage, because chaos can lose the war effort. But delay, in his calculus, would not. Delay would hurt, but it wouldn't shatter the coalition. That was the bet, and it's why Americans in HQ could be furious and still be wrong about the full picture. They saw the enemy collapsing and wanted to turn collapse into surrender immediately. They were thinking like fighters. Eisenhower was thinking like an architect. Architects don't chase moments, they build structures. And structures don't break from one bad day. That's what he needed. Now, the verdict can be said in one clean chain. Eisenhower chose Montgomery's plan because it reduced variables. Reduced variables kept the coalition governable. A governable coalition could sustain pressure without a catastrophic spiral. But that same control slowed tempo. Slower tempo gave the enemy time. Time increased the blood price. Time increased the geopolitical price. That is the cost of playing safe. And now, the final hammer. Stalin could negotiate with governments. He could bargain with committees. He could pressure parties. But Patton was not a government. He was not a committee. He was a variable. A variable you couldn't negotiate with. A variable that could create facts on the ground faster than politics could plan for them. That unpredictability is the one thing a control system cannot tolerate. Stalin feared uncontrollable people because uncontrollable people create uncontrollable outcomes. And uncontrollable outcomes are where control systems die. So in the end, Eisenhower's choice isn't just a story about Allied tactics. It's a story about how power chooses what it can handle. It chooses systems over impulses. It chooses governability over velocity. It chooses a war that can be controlled. And then it pays the price. In time, in initiative, and in lives. The easiest mistake after a story like this is to turn it into a moral lesson. Be bold, or be careful. History doesn't reward slogans. History rewards matching your method to your constraints. So if we ask the counterfactual, what if Eisenhower didn't choose governability? There's only one honest way to do it. Not by inventing miracles, by shifting the trade-offs. Because the alternative to playing safe isn't playing smart, it's playing a different kind of expensive. So let's strip this down to what changes and what doesn't. What doesn't change? The roads are still the roads. The ports are still the ports. Fuel is still finite. Coalition politics still exist. Weather still happens. The enemy still has the ability to gamble. Constraints don't disappear because you choose courage. What changes is how you spend those constraints. Option 1, you go all in on speed. You choose one thrust as the main effort and you feed it brutally. You accept that other fronts will pause. You accept political resentment inside the coalition. You accept gaps. You do it anyway. The upside is clear. Speed can turn retreat into collapse. Speed can deny the enemy time to organize. Speed can shorten the war dramatically if it hits the right nervous system. It's not fantasy to say that faster exploitation can produce faster endings. But the downside is also clear, and it's why supreme commanders fear it. When you go all in on speed, you concentrate not only power, you concentrate vulnerability. You create a single point of failure. If the thrust stalls through fuel shortage, bridge destruction, bad weather, unexpected resistance, you don't just lose momentum, you lose credibility. Because you made everyone else wait for your bet to pay off. And when your bet stalls, the coalition doesn't just get nervous, it gets angry. Anger becomes blame. Blame becomes fracture. Fracture becomes commanders protecting their own interests. The war becomes harder to coordinate. So the all-in speed plan has a success condition and a failure condition. Success condition. The thrust moves faster than the enemy can respond, and the war ends before politics can turn. Failure condition. The thrust stalls, the enemy counterattacks into exposed seams, and the coalition starts operating like separate kingdoms. That failure condition doesn't have to lose the war, but it can extend the war in a different way, through dysfunction rather than enemy strength. and dysfunction is a lethal kind of delay. Option 2. You try a hybrid. You allow exploitation, but you cap it. You keep a faster tempo, but you refuse deep commitments without approval. You ration initiative. On paper, this sounds like the best of both worlds. In practice, it can become the worst. Because hybrid warfare creates half commitments. Half commitments are dangerous. They tempt commanders forward without providing the support needed to secure what they take. They create advances that look successful until the enemy counterattacks. They create salients that are impressive on maps and fragile on the ground. And they create constant negotiation between the top and the spear. Negotiate too much and you lose tempo. Negotiate too little and you lose control. Hybrids can work, but they demand exceptional clarity. And clarity is hard when your front is moving and your information is late. Option 3. You choose the variable. You decide that unpredictability is worth it. You empower a momentum commander and accept the political risk. The upside is again obvious. A momentum commander can create facts before committees can debate them. He can exploit windows that close in days. He can push the enemy past their ability to think. But the downside is why Eisenhower treated that kind of momentum like fire. Fire warms you. Fire also spreads. When a variable commander advances, the supreme commander becomes hostage to his momentum. Because once the variable is deep, you have only two choices: support him or abandon him. Support him means diverting fuel, ammo, and attention away from others. Abandon him means risking a defeat that becomes propaganda and a morale shock. So empowering the variable is not a one-time decision. It's a chain of obligations. And the longer that chain gets, the more it distorts the entire war effort. So the counterfactual isn't, would Patton have won faster? The counterfactual is, would Eisenhower have been willing to accept the cascading obligations that speed creates? That's the real question. Because speed is not just movement. Speed is commitment, and commitment is political. Now here's the micro-reveal that keeps the counterfactual honest. Even if speed shortens the war, speed can also create a different kind of crisis. A crisis of boundaries. If the Western allies arrive faster, they don't just end the shooting sooner. They also arrive earlier to more places. Earlier arrival changes who occupies what. Occupation changes who governs what. Governance changes post-war legitimacy. So the counterfactual includes a geopolitical collision. If the Western advance is faster and deeper, friction with the East increases. Not necessarily through open conflict, but through hard bargaining. Bargaining over cities, over zones, over administration, over who disarms which groups and installs which police. That bargaining is easier when your armies are physically present, harder when you're still pushing through the last German defenses. So the counterfactual speed plan would likely tighten the post-war contest earlier. That can be good or bad depending on outcomes, but it would be more volatile. And volatility is what control systems fear. So here is what we can say without pretending to be prophets. If Eisenhower prioritized speed more aggressively, he could potentially shorten the war. But he would increase the risk of a coalition crisis or a stalled thrust that creates a different delay. He would also increase post-war volatility by changing occupation realities faster. In other words, the costs don't vanish, they move. Now bring it back to the moral center of the story. Eisenhower did not choose Montgomery because he loved slowness. He chose it because he feared spirals. Spirals are the enemy of coalitions. Spirals turn victory into blame. Blame turns unity into fragmentation. And fragmentation is the one outcome that can make you lose control of the end. So his decision is defensible. But defensible isn't the same as optimal. Because war doesn't only punish mistakes, it punishes caution when the enemy is weakest. And the enemy is never weakest for long. That's why the story stays painful. The safe choice protects you from a dramatic failure, but it may also protect the enemy from total collapse. It may also give time to the people waiting to shape the peace. And time is a weapon anyone can use. Germany used time to gamble, Stalin used time to arrive.
Eisenhower used time to govern. 3 uses, 3 costs. That's the cleanest way to leave the counterfactual. Not as a fantasy of instant victory, as a trade of risks. A trade Eisenhower refused to make because he didn't want a war that could become ungovernable. He wanted a war he could control. And control was the thing everyone at the tip of the spear underestimated. Because control doesn't look heroic, it looks slow. But slow is what keeps coalitions intact. And intact is what keeps your victory from collapsing into a political mess. So the counterfactual doesn't prove Eisenhower wrong. It reveals what he was optimizing for. He wasn't optimizing for speed. He was optimizing for survivable coordination. That's why he could live with delay. He couldn't live with a crisis that breaks the machine. And that is why playing safe is not a coward's decision. It's a manager's decision. A decision that protects the system and then sends men to pay the interest. At the end of this story, it's tempting to pick a side, to crown the bold as right, to crown the cautious as wise. But the real lesson is colder. War is not only fought against the enemy, it's fought against what you can't control. And Eisenhower's entire job was control. Control of armies, control of supply, control of allies, control of tempo, control of expectations. Because the moment control breaks, the war stops being a campaign and becomes a crisis. That's why he chose a governable method. That's why he leaned toward Montgomery's plan. Not because it was the most thrilling, because it was the most manageable. But manageable doesn't mean cheap. Manageable means the costs are predictable, scheduled, accounted for. A controlled war is a war you can brief, a war you can explain, a war you can keep coherent. And that coherence has a price: time. Time is what lets a coalition stay aligned. Time is what lets supply catch up. Time is what lets commanders coordinate instead of collide. Time is also what lets the enemy recover. Time is what lets the losing side gamble. Time is what lets them build the defenses you have to bleed into. And time is what lets the East keep moving. So the bill arrives from 3 directions at once. From Germany as resistance hardens. From your own armies as casualties accumulate into caution. From geopolitics as occupation becomes destiny. That's why safe is such a dangerous word. Safe implies protection. What Eisenhower chose wasn't protection, it was containment. Containment of chaos inside his own coalition. Containment of ego. Containment of operational volatility. He chose to keep the machine stable, and stable machines don't move like wildfires. They move like engines. Engines are powerful. Engines are steady. Engines are also limited by fuel lines, by maintenance, by throughput. You can rev them, you can't ignore physics. That's the heart of the decision, and it leads to the final theme: control versus unpredictability. Stalin was control turned into a state, a system designed to remove randomness from power. That's why he was patient. That's why he was calculating. That's why time favored him. Because time turns occupation into legitimacy, and legitimacy is power that survives the war. Patton was unpredictability turned into momentum, a force that doesn't wait for perfect conditions, a force that turns half chances into facts. And facts are the one thing control systems hate, because facts don't ask permission. They force negotiation after the outcome, not before it. That's why the Patton variable is more frightening than any single German unit. Not because he was unstoppable, because he was ungovernable at high speed. You can negotiate with governments. You can negotiate with committees. You can negotiate with allied priorities. You can't negotiate with a variable once it's moving. You can only feed it, or starve it, support it, or restrain it. And every time you restrain it, you preserve control. And every time you preserve control, you risk buying time at the wrong price. So Eisenhower's choice becomes clear. He chose Montgomery's plan because it reduced variables, because it fit the coalition, because it could be supplied, because it could be explained, because it could be governed.
And then he paid for that governance, in time, in initiative, in the blood price of a longer war. That is the cost of playing safe. The story isn't that Eisenhower was weak. The story is that power often prefers what it can manage, even when what it can manage is slower. Because slow is predictable, and predictable is negotiable. Stalin understood that. He could negotiate with governments. He could bargain with allies. He could pressure committees. But a variable you couldn't negotiate with? That was the one thing he couldn't control. That's why uncontrollable people mattered, not as heroes, as disruptions. Disruptions that move reality faster than systems can shape it. And in the end, that's what this whole decision exposes. When victory is close, the most dangerous enemy is no longer the one in front of you. It's the uncertainty inside your own side, the ambition to finish fast, the fear of catastrophic embarrassment, the temptation of momentum, the comfort of control. Eisenhower chose comfort? No, he chose responsibility. And responsibility is often indistinguishable from slowness. That's the final irony. The commander trying to save lives by avoiding disaster can end up spending more lives through delay. Not because he failed, because the trade-offs were real. And the world after the war wasn't going to be decided only by who won. It was going to be decided by who arrived first, and who had time to turn a rival into power. So the verdict stands. Eisenhower chose Montgomery's plan because his job was to avoid disaster, not chase glory. But the safe choice wasn't free. It cost time. It cost initiative. And in war, anything that costs time eventually costs lives. And the reason this story still matters is simple. You can negotiate with systems. You can't negotiate with variables. And sometimes, the variable is the only thing that can end the war before the bill comes due. If you want more history told like mechanics, subscribe. Because the next story isn't about who was the best general. It's about what happens when a victory becomes a negotiation, and time decides who writes the terms.